Today on Straight Talk Africa, we look at the recent political developments in Zimbabwe. Last week, President Emmerson Mnangagwa appointed a smaller cabinet. But to what extent does it reflect the diversity of the primary stakeholders of the republic? Or is it more of the same ZANU-PF that has ruled the Southern African country since 1980? That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America studios here in Washington. I am Shaka Ssali.
Hello, Shaka, and hello to all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Ayan Bior, your social media reporter.
Today, we are discussing the changing political landscape in Zimbabwe.
And coming up later, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook, and Twitter comments. We'll reveal some of them ahead on Straight Talk Africa.
Zimbabwe's new president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, has sworn in his cabinet, with allies defending him against criticism for giving top posts to the generals who helped his rise to power. Mr. Mnangagwa has also come under fire for bringing back several faces from the Mugabe era, including Patrick Chinamasa as finance minister, Air Marshal Perance Shiri, who was handed the sensitive land portfolio, is feared and loathed by many Zimbabweans as the former commander of the North Korean-trained 5th Brigade that played a central role in ethnic massacres in Matebeleland in 1983, in which an estimated 20,000 people were killed. Another military figure is Foreign Minister Sibusiso Moyo, whom most Zimbabweans remember as the khaki-clad general who went on state television in the early hours of November 15th to announce the military takeover. There was strong reaction to the new Zimbabwean cabinet. Critics say it's not a step in a new direction, but a step back into the past. The director of Human Rights Watch in Southern Africa, Dewa Mavinga, spoke to Africa 54's Vincent Makori about the caliber of Mnangagwa's cabinet and how those appointments could shape the country's political future.
I think of greater concern and worry is the appointment of two serving military generals, Air Marshal Perance Shiri and Major General Somoyo, to cabinet with very key posts. This shows that really there is a militarization of civilian affairs, and that Mnangagwa appears to be rewarding the military for staging the coup in November.
Mavinga says these familiar faces should be a warning sign for the opposition ahead of next year's presidential elections.
Mnangagwa wants to appease the generals. It appears there is no space for an inclusive government. He has not reached out to anyone in the opposition, and we are going to elections in 2018. And the concern there is that, well, if the opposition were to win, would the military generals accept an opposition win and accept democracy? It is unlikely, because they might actually again intervene in politics. So we have a tough road ahead, and Mnangagwa has shown that he is continuing with Mugabe's legacy effectively.
Well, we'll check with you again some other time just to see what's the progress in Zimbabwe from your own perspective.
Sure.
Thanks a lot, Dewa, for joining us today.
Now, joining us here in the studio are two distinguished guests. Muzi Ncube, organizing secretary of Zimbabwe's main political opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, U.S.A. province, and Nii Akuetteh, African policy analyst and activist. He previously served as Trans-Africa's Director for Research and Education here in Washington, D.C. We also invited Dr. Frank Guni, the ZANU-PF representative in Washington, D.C., but due to a scheduling conflict, he could not participate in today's program. Well, gentlemen, I have to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome, of course, Muzi, and especially with you, really. This is the first time we are interacting on Straight Talk Africa.
Yes, it is.
Where have you been?
Well, I'm around. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I will be happy to come back now that you know I'm around.
Very interesting. You just heard some criticism regarding the recent, in fact, it was last week's cabinet appointments by President Mnangagwa,
Yes.
the crocodile.
Yes.
Any particular reason why he's being criticized, frankly, for reaching out to the military? Only two actually cabinet ministers, so to speak. And one of them, a Major General Moyo himself, happens in fact to have a PhD, a doctorate of philosophy in international relations, from what I have gathered.
Well, what I can say is that I hear this rhetoric that we are just now getting a military-run government in Zimbabwe, but in all honesty, I think the military has always been involved in our affairs in Zimbabwe because, you know, they are the ones that liberated Zimbabwe, first of all. And then even after independence, when we thought that we were free, we were independent, we saw the military come to Midlands and Matabeleland, the 5th Brigade, like you mentioned, that was trained in North Korea to come and maim and intimidate and really do bad things to people of Midlands and Matabeleland. So the military has always been among Zimbabweans.
But when you talk about the military in Zimbabwe, are you talking about the military wing, for example, of ZANU Patriotic Front? Because let's face it, there used to be also a military wing of ZAPU Patriotic Front.
Yes.
So what happened to the ZAPU Patriotic Front military wing? Were they also in cahoots with their comrades when it came to 1983 in Matabeleland?
Well, what happened really was that in the early 80s, obviously the ZANU-led government had majority of, you know, Shona-speaking people in there, and there were some Ndebele-speaking people there. So really, you know, the atrocities were not really perpetrated by, say, the Shona people against the Ndebele people.
Right.
You know, like how the government, ZANU-PF, tries to play this whole thing as a tribal thing, and, you know, it's really not like that. You know, it was perpetrated by the government itself, and the government itself actually was very inclusive of, you know, there were majority of Shonas, like I said, but, you know, there were Ndebele people that were there, and what happened was very sad because, you know, we were supposed to be independent, you know, and we saw the military yet again come into the southern part of the country to really intimidate the people in Midlands and Matabeleland because they were seen as more sympathetic and supportive to ZAPU, which was led by Joshua Nkomo.
Joshua Nkomo,
yes.
yes.
And so the whole Kukurahunde, as it's known, happened between those, what, 1982, I think 83 to around 85, and then there was a unity government now in 87. Okay, so that's when ZANU-PF and ZAPU came together. Yep. So since then, really the government of ZANU-PF has had both ZANU-PF representatives and ZAPU-PF representatives, but we've seen, I forget what year that was, when Dumiso Tabengwa, you know, broke away from the unity government and said, you know what, this is not what ZAPU stood for, and what ZANU-PF is doing with all this corruption and human rights violations, and he decided to break away and say, you know what, I'm leaving with ZAPU, but there was still some other ZAPU leaders that remained in the government.
I think it is fair to point out that the government in Zimbabwe normally has 2 vice presidents.
Yes.
And one of the vice presidents, especially the second vice president,
yes,
represents ZAPU
yes.
PF. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, earlier you talked about how you thought you were independent in 1983, and yet you were not. Who did you think you were independent from? Are we talking about the former rebel Prime Minister of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, or are you talking about a new kid on the block in Harare that was led by, of course, Prime Minister Robert Gabriel Mugabe?
Well, obviously, the liberation was to fight, colonial rule. So we were liberated from, colonial domination and the regime of Ian Smith that was really seen as very racist, and our liberation was really from that.
He actually said that he did not think that even in 1,000 years, the Bantu,
yes,
the local indigenous Zimbabweans, would actually gain political independence and run the affairs of the country.
That's very true. The same way that Robert Mugabe said the same things. He never thought that he would ever leave power.
Never thought that he would be the former president.
He never thought he would be the former president.
Perhaps just the late, because there would be divine intervention of sorts.
Hey, there you go. Mm-hmm.
You know, your boss, Robert, your boss is Morgan Richard Tsvangirai.
Yes. Uh-huh.
He once told me in an interview that in his view, Zimbabwe has been very unlucky in the sense that it has had 2 very stubborn men. And he mentioned Ian Smith and Robert Mugabe. Was he right?
Yeah, very correct.
Why?
Well, look at what happened. Ian Smith, we had to go to war to get him out. You see what I'm saying? So, and Robert Mugabe, also he had to take the military to get him out.
His own military?
Yes, his own military, you see. So there is a lot of similarities there, It seems like there is just something with power that people cannot just relinquish power, and they cannot let go. And everybody, most of these African leaders believe that, they are the chosen. And in what we've seen for the most part is that they really choose themselves, because, we've seen what has happened there in Uganda, where President Museveni all of a sudden just became a young dude.
What happened?
He just became a young guy so that he can...
In what sense? In what sense?
Sorry?
In what sense?
Well, in the fact that he, I guess, got some of the, is it a Catholic priest who said, no, well, this guy was actually much younger. His date of birth had to be changed and stuff like that, because so that he can run for the election.
No, but let's face it, this is a man who wrote a book, essentially, and he talks about how he does not know exactly when he was born, because at the time, he says, there were no really records that would be kept for somebody to be born, and therefore he was in a position to simply make a guess that he was born probably after, following such and such events and all kind of stuff. And he wrote that in an autobiography, which I think is entitled In Search of a Mustard Seed, or something of that sort. Then at the same time, as we talk, there is a process in the Ugandan parliament. There is a petition that seeks, in fact, to amend a particular article which would make it possible to remove the age cap so that he could then be eligible to run for another term. And in fact, they're even suggesting this time that 5 years is, after all, a very, very short time. You should, in fact, extend it by at least 7.
Well, there you go again. Why were not all these things mentioned way back then? Why were not these things mentioned? Why just now, just because there's going to be an election? And he's already been a president in Uganda there for over 20 years. So why want to run again? He's not the only person in Uganda there that is very smart. There are a lot of young technocrats there in Uganda who can really take Uganda to a, total different level.
But his supporters really say and insist that he is a very uniquely gifted individual, without whom perhaps Uganda actually could not go on really as a republic. He has actually, for the record, said personally that he is the only man with the vision think. He's the only man who can think for his country, his people, and the rest of his people who are supposed to be citizens probably become subjects. Their job is essentially to implement and execute his vision.
Well, let me put it this way. If Museveni then thinks that he is the real man, he should let the people of Uganda make that decision.
Well, he will tell you, of course, that he holds periodic elections every 5 years.
Well, we saw what happened the last election. There's never been free and fair elections. It's the same thing that's really been happening in Zimbabwe there. So you have all these African dictators who will come up with all these reasons to be able to stay in power. And look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has been independent for the past 37 years. And, a 37-year-old only knew former President Robert Mugabe.
When you talk about Zimbabwe, is there a separation of, for example, the ruling party, ZANU-PF, and the state or the government, or are the two, in fact, fused?
Well, I would say they are probably fused because they are really not independent because, they are really fused because, everything that is happening is, it's not a check and balance. It's one sets an agenda and then the other one follows.
So then why do you, in fact, even have criticism regarding the new cabinet? Could you please weigh in here? Why is it that people are talking about having two generals in a cabinet of 22?
Well, because you know how the transition was made to make Mr. Mugabe the former president. The military played a huge role in it. I have seen people who say, well, look at the jubilation that we saw on the streets. But that jubilation followed the movement of the tanks. That jubilation followed the general, Chiwenga, actually going on having a press conference and saying that if our people keep being sidelined in ZANU-PF, we are going to move. Remember, they had also said over and over and over previously that they will not take orders from anybody who did not have liberation credentials. That always shocked me because as my brother here, and I tease him that he's my in-law. Yes. Because I'm from Ghana.
Yes.
And that...
You're talking about Ssali.
Yes. Ssali Mugabe was my sister, so to speak. Yes. Exactly. And you know, it always shocked me that the military will say we will not take orders from anybody who doesn't have liberation credentials, which means that no matter how brilliant you are in Zimbabwe, if you are 37, you could, or younger, you could not have participated in the liberation struggle, and therefore you are out of power. I mean, look at France and the age of their president. So it was shutting out a whole lot of people. So frankly, I am very sympathetic to the criticism of the new cabinet, including the inclusion of these generals. And of course, another side issue is the issue has been, was this really a coup or not? I think it was a coup, and I'm disappointed that SADC and the African Union are turning a blind eye, because I happen to think that one of the best things that the African Union ever did. Now, they've done a lot of things that doesn't get the the publicity and the credit it deserves. But one thing that I give them full credit for was when through Mr. Mbeki and President Obasanjo and others said, if you come to power by unconstitutional means, you don't belong here. You have to go back and make sure you are in power constitutionally. Now, what just happened in Zimbabwe, in my humble opinion, is that it was a coup, but they did a few maneuvers and got the president to resign. I fear that other African militaries will say, okay, now instead of we're booting out everybody, we can put the president in a room, put a gun to his head, bring a paper and say he resigned, so it's not a coup. That worries me a lot.
Now, Nii, let's face it, were you surprised about the reaction or the non-reaction of the African Union towards what you characterize as a coup in Harare? First of all, everybody will agree with you that it was a de facto coup.
Yes.
But was it in fact a de jure coup? Did they in fact suspend the constitution? No. Where was the coup made this time around? It was made in Beijing. And if it was made in Beijing, tell me, who built that beautiful $200 million African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa?
I think actually that's a great question. It's something that I look at. There are people who really know, like my brother here, knows Zimbabwe very well. My angle is Zimbabwe's situation vis-a-vis other African countries and vis-a-vis the international community. I would tell you, when we are looking at Zimbabwe's future, what worries me is that I don't want Zimbabweans trusting the international community too much. We have to remember our history. We have to remember Zimbabwe's former name, Southern Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes. We should not trust the international community, whether it is China or Great Britain or the U.S. or the IMF and the World Bank. And yes, there's a question. I mean, General Chiwenga returned from China. Okay, just before the coup. Yeah. There was pictures of him with the Chinese military brass smiling. Now, the U.S. and other Western countries imposed sanctions on the Mugabe regime for a long time. So China stayed. China helped the Mugabe regime a lot. So they had an inside track. But it also happens that the indigenization policy that Mr. Mugabe put in place, the Chinese were not happy with it. They wanted changes made to benefit them. Mr. Mugabe did not give it to them.
But they also have very, very vast investments
absolutely.
in Zimbabwe.
Absolutely. They have more investment than anybody else, but the point is they wanted more. They did not want the restrictions in the indigenization policy. And therefore, the fact that General Chiwenga was there, and when they come, you can see that the whole thing was planned because Mr. Mnangagwa disappeared, walked into Mozambique, okay? The head of the former fighters for liberation also flew to South Africa. And reportedly, we are told, they told Mr. Zuma, whatever happens in Zimbabwe, don't call it a coup. So this was planned. And yes, I think, as you suggest, for me, I want to know more China's role. But it all comes down to my view that, yes, Zimbabwe belongs to Zimbabweans, but one of the things we have to look at is how does the world treat an African country? And therefore, please don't trust anybody. Double check, triple check. It doesn't matter whether they are from the East or the West, because the wealth of Zimbabwe should belong to Zimbabweans.
But in fairness, frankly, to the Zimbabwean army or the coup, as it were, let's face it, they were very, very, I think, exceedingly disciplined. They were very civil. It pretty much looked like, in fact, what you would call a popular mass uprising, so to speak, even though, of course, you had tanks and what have you.
Well, I'm skeptical about that because, part of my work here is to look at, I would love for U.S. relations with Africa to make us a goal promoting democracy. I've been called a fanatic for democracy.
To what extent has the United States promoted a democracy around the world? There was a time during the Clinton administration, for example.
Yes.
They came up with this formula of you know,
New
a new
African
bleed
leaders, yes.
of African leaders,
Rwanda,
the beacons
yes,
of hope for African democracy.
Precisely.
They started with Isaias Afwerki in Asmara.
Yes.
They went down to Addis Ababa,
Right.
Meles Zenawi,
Right.
went down to Kampala,
Right.
Yoweri Museveni,
Right.
went to Kigali,
Right.
Paul Kagame.
Right.
In fact, even there to go to Kinshasa, Laurent Desire Kabila.
Yes.
So
yes.
what is democracy? What is the beacon of
here is
African
my
democracy
point.
here?
In fact, I would tell you that the record of the United States in supporting dictatorships in Africa and undemocratic relations goes even farther. You know, apartheid was in South Africa before Ghana became independent. The U.S. supported apartheid, okay? They supported Mobutu. They supported, to my mind, in fact, the worst regime that they supported was Hissène Habré in Chad. Ronald Reagan put him in power when he was a warlord on the run in Darfur, okay? He killed a lot of people. He's been tried and put into jail. Mr. Trump today said his favorite African leader is Field Marshal Sisi in Cairo. So I'm saying to you, the U.S. has a long record of supporting dictatorships in Africa. But here is the kicker for me. There are a lot of Africans here and friends of Africa in the United States. There's political space. We have to push. We can change U.S. foreign policy towards Africa if we get our act right, if we speak out, if we push, if we look at the governors we elect, the congressmen we elect, the senators we elect, and the president we elect. Until we do that, we are not going to get it. If you'll forgive me one more thing. When Mr. Obama was in power, I heard a lot of Africans say, oh, we are so disappointed. He hasn't done enough because his father was Kenyan. We thought he would do more for Africa. And my point is, in the U.S. system, it is the communities that organize and push hard who get what they want. If Africans and their friends in the United States don't organize, you don't expect Mr. Obama to solve every problem in Africa.
Because unlike many African countries, the United States is governed by strong institutions.
Yes.
Not strong men.
Yes.
Precisely.
Like Africa.
As Mr. Obama said in Accra.
Now, you were at Trans-Africa.
Yes.
And you talk about the United States supporting apartheid.
Yes.
But you, as Trans-Africa, you lobbied so heavily to the extent that the United States eventually had to listen to you.
It was an amazing experience. You know, it has shaped me as we sit here. It makes me look at what can be done. Some people have said to me, it's too difficult, you can't organize. And I'm saying, no, because it's nothing compared to what happened under Mr. Reagan. Everybody will tell you Mr. Reagan was one of the most popular presidents in recent...
Mr. Reagan, of course, and Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady.
Yes, they were defenders of apartheid. And yet, the work that the Free South Africa movement did here, led by Trans-Africa, where I happened to work, put together a movement that put so much pressure. The amazing thing is people like Newt Gingrich, the whole Republicans, people who were friends of Mr. Reagan, broke with him and said, Mr. President, this is wrong. What the South Africans are doing is terrible. We have to distance ourselves. Okay.
So what did Randall Robinson do really? Because the Kennedys, of course, came along and a lot of senators.
Yes, because, they put together a great coalition, actually. I'll tell you a little anecdote. My daughter, who is now, a mature woman, was 7 years old. And at one point when I wanted to leave Trans-Africa, she said, Daddy, you can't leave Trans-Africa. I said, why? I need to go a place and make more money. She said, no, because where else can you work where I'll meet all these senators and all these celebrities? Stevie Wonder came to be arrested.
Unfortunately, time happens not to be your best ally. And on that note, you are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment, including our social media segment. So please, don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that, inspiration to come to work.
Today's youth are not just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them. Today, not tomorrow. So let's connect. Let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Up Front every Wednesday, 17:30 UTC, right here on the Voice of America.
Thank you very much, of course, Jackson Muvuganyi, and welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in our social media reporter, Ayen Biyor. Take it away, Ayen.
Well, thank you, Shaka. Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was sworn in the wake of a military coup that ended Mugabe's 37-year rule, has pledged to hold elections next year. Opposition parties are demanding reforms to an electoral system they say is skewed in the ruling party's ZANU-PF party's favor. This leads us to our question of the week, which asks, what do you think should be done in Zimbabwe to make sure that social and economic justice prevails for all? Well, let's start the conversation with a tweet from Nyarai Humba, who writes, without democracy in place, investors will flock because they can maximize their profits by paying very low wages and keep workers in horrible working conditions. Free media will bring corruption out. No one is above the law, and they can't rig elections if ZEC is independent. Voting without the ZANU-PF ruling us forever. We have another tweet from Musa Tumasange, who takes on an extreme approach and tweets, lock all of Mugabe's corrupt puppets and confiscate their properties, which is part of economic benefits which they gained from this dictator. Well, now to our social media comment of the week from Facebook fan Lukuma Chisenge from Zambia, who writes, the irony in Zimbabwe is that they think ousting the old man unconstitutionally is solving the problem, but it will only benefit a few individuals who will run Zimbabwe under an oligarchy. Zimbabwe's economy will stabilize to enrich the ruling class only and leave out the vulnerable proletariat. Well, let's go to another comment from Facebook fan Arsen Kwao-Yu, who writes, the problem is that Zimbabweans think that a position in high office is right for those who fought for independence. Even if they elected a new leader, he would still preach the legacy of the fight for independence and not focus on developing the nation and supporting the majority who are poor. Well, now to our last Facebook comment from Gubula Abbey from Uganda, who writes, for social and economic justice to prevail, the expropriated land by the ZANU-PF government must be appropriated to the lawful owners. Of course, Shaka and guest, who are the lawful owners is often debated in Zimbabwe. Well, a reminder that we appreciate all the audience feedback. If you're a new fan, drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. To comment on our Facebook page, just enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com. To join our YouTube channel, sign up to VOA TV2 Africa. Follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook, or simply go to VOA's Straight Talk Africa TV program page on our website. To watch us live on your mobile device, just download the VOA mobile app. Now let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. Next, on Straight Talk Africa, we'll take a look at major events that are shaping the continent right now, with a focus on the United States and its policies toward Africa. We'll examine how those dynamics will play out in 2018. That's next week, right here on Straight Talk Africa. Well, that's all for today's social media segment. Shaka, you and the guest have a lot of social media comments to discuss. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Ayen, for sharing some social media reaction from the audience. And of course, welcome back. And today's topic is the changing political landscape in Zimbabwe. And our distinguished guests are Muzi Ncube, Organizing Secretary, MDC U.S.A. Province, and Nii Akuetteh, African Policy Analyst and Activist. We also invited Dr. Frank Guni, the ZANU-PF representative in Washington, D.C., but due to a scheduling conflict, he could not participate in today's program. I have to say again, gentlemen, that I'm profoundly, profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to interact with you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. You know, earlier, Nii talked about how people who said or called themselves liberators,
yes,
that they are liberators and therefore they will not allow anybody who was not part of their group to rule the country. Now, when you talk about liberators, and this is not limited to Zimbabwe, by the way.
yes,
This seems to be a culture of all those people who call themselves liberators.
yeah.
Who, when they talk about liberating, who are they in fact liberating? Or who were they supposed to be liberating? Was it about their stomachs, the stomachs of their families and friends, or about a nation?
Well, thank you again. It seems like that's exactly what it has been. You know, the liberation struggles in Africa has just been really seen to have been liberation struggles just for a few individuals. And, you know, like you've mentioned, we've seen it in quite a lot of countries. And it seems like they are stuck with us forever and ever. And they can never get it in their heads that, you know, the liberation struggle was really to liberate all the people in the country so that there will be, you know, self-sustenance and self-benefit for everybody, not just a few.
Why do they think that they have a particular sense of entitlement? It is true that they obviously sacrificed. There's no question about it. There are a lot of people who were their comrades along the way who died. There are people who got sick and got impoverished and what have you. But frankly, what makes them think that they actually have a sense of entitlement to a country?
I think it's just really individual selfishness. That's all I can think about. It's really individual selfishness, because when you are liberating a people, the intentions are really geared to be able to move people to a better and progressive stage from where they were, you see? And that's not what has happened in Zimbabwe. You know, we've seen that the people that have been progressive and lived these, you know, rich lifestyles are actually the people that are aligned with the government. And, you know, we saw the big homes that were built by, you know, some ZANU officials who were really making less than $1,000 a month.
There's a gentleman who reportedly has a 50-room mansion.
There you go.
Yeah, but let's face it, at least since 1980 to about 2000, you seem to have experienced some very progressive policies in Zimbabwe. You had, for example, arguably one of the best educational policies,
yes,
frankly. You also had probably one of the best health care system. So that was not about selfishness. That was about the country, inclusive. And then, of course, after 2000, after the failed referendum, which would have helped Mr. Mugabe bring about some kind of appropriate land reform, which he told me in an interview in 2000 in a New York City hotel, that he was hoping that that referendum would go through, and in fact it also had a caveat of presidential term limits at that time.
Yes.
But it was unanimously shot down. But he went on a couple of years later to implement his land reform.
Yeah.
And he said, frankly, just like Idi Amin Dada had done back in 1972 in Uganda, expelling the Asian community because, according to him, they were basically looting the economy, correct? He said that he was empowering Ugandans in order to be the masters in their own country. Mugabe said he was doing the same with that piece of land. Didn't he do it? Or was it, in fact, was the process of policy selective in the sense that you had to be a ZANU-PF card-carrying member to have unfettered access to that real estate?
Yeah, that's very true. You see, in the early 80s, really after independence, if it was not really for the Kukurahundi 5th Brigade that came and killed a whole bunch of people there in Midlands and Matabeleland, I think Zimbabwe and then Prime Minister Robert Mugabe had started somewhat in a very good path. And like you've mentioned that, you know, our early, what is in the 90s there, you know, we had a very excellent education
very
system.
Progressive.
Yes, very excellent.
Yeah.
You know, one of the best in Africa, and it still is in the top 5, really.
And you also, of course, were looked at as the bread basket.
Yes, exactly.
Of the region.
Yes, yeah. So we were all that. And, you know, we can even see that in this, the new budget that actually was unveiled here a week ago, we saw that, you know, we injected about almost $1 billion in education, you know, to make sure that, you know, Zimbabwe stays, you know, up there in terms of having, you know, one of the most educated Africans. And it's really our education too that has made Zimbabweans become very successful.
And the healthcare, of course, you end up exporting most of your doctors to your neighbors in South Africa.
Go. Yes.
Well, given that you had what one would call recently a really sophisticated healthcare system, how come the Zimbabwean authorities, right from President Mugabe, have even go to a place like Singapore for medical checkup, not in Zimbabwe itself?
Well,
and
exactly.
then, you know, the crocodile, when he reportedly said that he felt that he was probably poisoned, he actually had to fly literally to South Africa.
Yeah, it's very sad because, you know, like you mentioned, that, you know, our institutions that were very strong in the beginning, you know, they all just weeded away because there was really no more money injected to be able to sustain them because, you know, a lot of people there in the government were stealing money. There was a lot of corruption. So all the money that was actually budgeted to be able to uplift the healthcare industry was actually misused. And we've seen our healthcare delivery system go down. You know, we have now Zimbabweans were bringing their own bottles of medicine. You know, you have to bring your own medicine, bring, you know, certain equipment for you to be able to be taken care of. And really, this is not what we want in our Zimbabwe.
So, Muzi, what is the way forward, really? Because let's face it, your boss or the chairman of your party, MDC, Mr. Changirai, says that what Zimbabwe needs actually is a trajectory change. Is this a trajectory change?
Well, it's not quite a trajectory change because, you know, like you've mentioned that, you know, it's the military is heavily involved and, you know, it cannot really be the change that we want. But if we look at the other pros now, because Zimbabwe, you know, has been a country that has really been going down for the past 37 years, really regressing, let me put it that way.
Really?
When other countries, our neighbors, have been progressive, especially when you look at Botswana. You know, when you look at Zimbabwe 37 years ago, where Botswana was, and 37 years later, where Botswana is today, you know, they've shown signs of progressiveness because, you know, of the way they run their government and transparency to be able to build their country. And we've seen that their resources have actually helped their citizens, you know, go abroad to get an education, you see, which is exactly what we want for Zimbabwe and all of Africa, really, to be able to utilize our resources to be able to provide for our people.
So how do you do that? How do you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, in Zimbabwe, what we need is a very good electoral reform system. In every African country, you know, when we actually really spend time as Africans to engineer an even a playing platform, okay, where we have
a political, essentially what you are saying is a a political platform that is leveled.
That is level, yes, to where, you know, we don't have repressive laws that hinder media from being able to broadcast and be able to provide objective assessments to anything that is going on in the country, you know, impeding journalists to be able to practice their professions, you understand? So all those type of things, you know, are very impeding to democracy. And in Zimbabwe, what we need really is that, to have good, free and fair elections. And we're hoping that this new president, Mnangagwa, he has mentioned that, you know, his epithet is to be able to provide, make sure that there is a good provision for free and fair elections in Zimbabwe.
Just hold it, because again, time is not our best ally. You're tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll continue our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away, because we'll be right back to you.
The lyrics could be French,
English,
Portuguese,
Bantu,
Arabic.
It is the beat.
The African beat that counts.
The beat does all the translations.
It cuts across all languages and gives us the understanding that this is the African beat.
It is so distinct
and adhesive.
It binds us together.
African beat on the Voice of America. For more information, visit our website at www.voanews.com/AfricanBeat.
If you like today's show, please write and tell us what you think or give us some suggestions. Be sure to tell us what station you're tuned into. Our address, Straight Talk Africa, Voice of America, 330 Independence Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20237, USA. Or send us an email at africatv@voanews.com. Log on to our website at voaafrica.com. Or post your comments on Facebook. Keywords Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizu. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa coming to you live from Washington. Let me come to you, Nii. You listened, of course, to Muzi, and he seems to be making a lot of sense.
Yes, he did, and especially the way forward for Zimbabwe. But if you allow me, I just want to add that the people who liberated Africa, Africa's liberation leaders, yes, many of them stayed too long, but we must separate that from the actual fight of liberating the continent. That was a huge thing that they did, and they may have gone wrong, but we need to give them credit for that. And
are you
also,
talking about the Osage type of liberators?
Yes.
Those
yes,
who actually did not liberate their countries with AK-47?
Yeah, yes, you know, but, being from Ghana and West Africa, I've had compliments from Southern Africans who said, you know, you guys kept your culture and everything. And I said, well, but we were lucky geographically because West Africa is hot and humid, has mosquitoes. So Europeans could not settle there. So it made our liberation struggle easier.
Is that why, for example, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah at one time, in fact, suggested that you should have built a mosquito
Absolutely, absolutely. And we, the students of the Nkrumah era, we picked it up. We said, in fact, we should have the order of the mosquito, okay, that we award to people. So to come back, and also, you know, many stayed too long. But we must not forget that Mwalimu gave up power. We must not forget that the
Madiba did
also
not come to power via AK-47.
Right. But some of the liberators, you know, sometimes the pen is mightier than the sword. So their thinking and their writing led to liberation. So I put them together, those who used AK-47 and those who used their mind. My point is that
give me one single example of one of those liberators or those who actually call themselves revolutionaries.
Yes.
And I'm talking about the late brother leader,
yes,
Colonel Muammar Gaddafi,
yes,
the king of African kings.
Right.
I'm talking about now former Zimbabwean president, Robert Gabriel Mugabe.
Yes.
And I'm talking about incumbent Ugandan president, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni.
Yes. I concede that all those people you have mentioned, stayed too long. And as
but they call them they call themselves revolutionaries.
You know,
and that they are not really supposed to simply leave State House.
You know, they are human,
and that they cannot, in fact, be removed from power with a piece of paper called a ballot.
Because from my point of view, they are human, okay? And they succumb to human weakness of power corrupting them. It was the exceptional few who had strength of character, like Madiba, like Mwalimu, who stepped down. Now, for the way forward for Zimbabwe, my concern, you know, yes, Zimbabweans are the ones who are going to take the country forward. So I agree with my brother here 1,000%. We have to have good elections. That's the way that the people of Zimbabwe will truly say who they want and what policies they want. But I, as a Pan-Africanist, I, as an in-law of the Zimbabweans, where I'm looking, one of the things that worries me is the alacrity with which the IMF wants to get in there, the alacrity with which Britain has said, oh, we will come and help you. These institutions and countries, from my observation, they don't want democracy in Africa. They want the resources for themselves.
I understand.
And they support dictators who will run through policies that are good for the so-called investors. So I say Zimbabweans should watch out. The decisions made must be what they want and what benefits them, not what benefits the outsiders who, as much as there were hardship under Mr. Mugabe, a contributing factor was the sanctions that they slammed on him. And to me, part of the reason for slamming the sanctions on him was because he took back stolen land.
Then, of course, then he moved to the east.
Yes.
And now we know how very rich, how very, very, very rich and extravagant, in fact, he is in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and a lot of other places like Malaysia.
There is no excuse for leaders, African leaders or leaders anywhere else, for being corrupt and for amassing all this wealth. I mean, if you bring it down to the basics, you are a single human being. How many houses can you sleep in? How many meals can you have? And in my view, once you have reached that level of a president or a prime minister or a leader, you are already in the history book. So why do you need all this wealth? You are supposed to use it for your people, so it's inexcusable. But I'm saying we need to watch out for the international community. They have a habit of attacking African leaders who want to keep the resources for their own people. They have a habit of demonizing them and squeezing them. We have to look at Africa's history.
Let's go back to Zimbabwe. You talk about, for example, the stolen land.
Yes.
Someone said the stolen land, correct?
Yes.
So was it stolen or wasn't it stolen?
I'm sorry?
Didn't the Zimbabwean government pass a law that allowed it, for example, to carry out that particular land reform policy?
Yes, when I talk about...
How did the original white commercial farmers get that land?
That's my point. You know, 2 days ago, I saw a headline in The Economist, which I thought was scandalous, because they said Mr. Mnangagwa will do well if he returns stolen property. And I'm saying the property was first stolen in the 1800s by Cecil Rhodes and his hordes, okay? And then land was stolen from indigenous Africans. We must not forget that.
As a matter of fact, I have the distinction of having hosted the former rebel Prime Minister of Rhodesia, Ian Smith. And we talked about that. This was at the beginning, actually, of Straight Talk Africa in 2000. He was actually living at one of his 2 farms. And he was telling me about how they found nobody there. And the whole land pretty much belonged to them because, after all, it was a sort of white man's burden. They were coming, in fact, to civilize the indigenous, Africans who lived around that area. But let's talk about these electoral reforms.
Yes.
The last time I was in Havarone interviewing, President Ian Khama. He likes to call himself President Seretse Khama, Ian Khama. He told me that he was not really worried about Mugabe anymore at that time because the elections would really be you know, free, fair, and transparent because there is what they call the SADC electoral code. What happened?
Well, I don't know when the interview was, but
this was 2009.
Okay.
And he was actually, I think, an ally of Mr. Changirai.
Okay. Well, we saw what happened then in, you know, just before that, 2008. You know, we had...
You won the first round.
Yep, we won the
Eventually,
elections.
you settled, of course, for a government of national unity,
yep.
in which Mr. Changirai becomes Prime Minister.
Yes.
But if I remember correctly, one General Constantino Chiwenga
yes.
could not salute him. Correct?
Exactly. Because exactly what you said before, that, you know, the liberation war heroes have this thing in their head that only them can be able to rule in their significant countries because they went to war.
And it seems to me the behavior was actually condoned by a man who was supposed to be the commander-in-chief of the Zimbabwean Armed Forces, President Robert Mugabe.
Exactly, which is probably why in 2008 he said, well, we lost. Let's give up power. And the same military refused because of exactly that.
And then, of course, in 2017, the same general
yes,
goes to State House,
so,
salutes his commander-in-chief and says,
yeah.
Mr. President, you are under arrest.
Yeah. So we have
and
these...
Mugabe collapses.
Yes. And we have these elections that are coming up next year. And, you know, with the heavy military involvement, so we are yet to see if the electoral reforms that are going to be dispensed are going to be those that are going to create a fair environment for all Zimbabweans to be able to choose the leader that they want and for opposition to be able to campaign. And from the little things that we have been seeing since President Mnangagwa has been sworn in, there's a lot of positive things that we see on the ground.
I think so, and I think he's talking the talk, but can he in fact walk the talk?
Well, that's what we are waiting to see. And also, just to be fair, you know, to even ZANU-PF and President Mnangagwa, he's only been president for less than a month, I think.
Yes,
so,
yes, it's true.
You know, so there is probably a lot that still has to be done, and maybe give him an opportunity to see what he's going to unveil. We have seen just a few things that he has done, especially, you know, the changing indigenization laws to be able to, you know, bring investors, and, you know, even the trimmed.
In order to succeed, he definitely have to try to be his own man.
Yeah.
He's a man who has a bachelor's law degree from the University of Zambia.
Yes.
And in addition,
yes,
he had military training in Tanzania, Egypt, and guess where? China.
China, yes, in China.
We talk about the military. What about him? We simply don't know his rank in the armed forces.
There you go. But we know that he is the president, and, you know.
Unfortunately, again, time is not our best ally. On that note, thanks to our guests, Muzi Ncube and Nii Akuetteh. Thanks to our field stations, along with our viewers and listeners. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning, it's Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, Zimbabwe. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.